Every afternoon, Atlas walked to the same old house and waited by the same wooden chair. The strange part was not where he went. The strange part was who was waiting for him. The quiet neighborhood noticed the German shepherd's routine long before Caleb Rowe understood it. Every day, just as the afternoon sun began to soften across the streets, Atlas would leave Caleb's side and follow the same familiar path. He never wandered. He never rushed. He simply walked with purpose toward a small house at the end of the road where an older retired Marine sat outside in silence. Caleb had seen the man before. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him as someone who preferred quiet mornings, quiet evenings, and a life without many visitors. The retired Marine rarely joined community gatherings. He politely greeted people, but he never invited anyone to stay. His front door was always closed. His porch chair was always occupied by one person. Until Atlas arrived. The first time Caleb noticed, he thought it was just a coincidence. Dogs were curious. They followed interesting smells and familiar places. But then it happened again and again. Every afternoon, Atlas returned to the same porch. The retired Marine would look up, give a small smile, and make room beside him. No big gestures. No long conversations. Just a quiet understanding between two souls. Caleb began watching from a distance, trying to understand what made this simple routine so special. Atlas was friendly with many people in the neighborhood. The German shepherd greeted children walking home from school and calmly walked beside Caleb during their daily patrols. But this was different. With the retired Marine, Atlas seemed completely at peace. One afternoon, Caleb walked closer and noticed something unusual. The old Marine had placed a second cup of water beside his chair. It was waiting before Atlas even arrived. Caleb stopped for a moment. That small detail said more than words ever could. Someone who never asked anyone else to stay had made a place for this dog. Caleb wondered what had created such a strong bond between them. The retired Marine had spent years protecting others, but now he lived quietly, almost invisible to the world around him. Atlas seemed to notice something that everyone else missed. That evening, Caleb sat at home thinking about what he had seen. He remembered how the retired Marine's expression changed when Atlas arrived. The quiet face became softer. The empty porch felt less empty. A simple visit had become something much bigger. The next day, Caleb decided to follow Atlas's path more carefully. He wanted to know why this German shepherd kept returning to the same place every afternoon. Because sometimes the smallest routines hold the deepest stories. And Caleb was about to discover that Atlas was not just visiting an old friend. He was bringing something back into a life that had been waiting in silence for someone to stay. The next afternoon, Caleb Rowe watched from across the street as Atlas followed the same familiar path once again. The German shepherd moved calmly through the neighborhood, passing the same trees, the same quiet sidewalks, and the same small houses until he reached the retired Marine's porch. Caleb had expected the old man to simply greet Atlas like any neighbor would greet a friendly dog. But what he saw was something much deeper. The retired Marine slowly stood from his chair and smiled before Atlas even reached the steps. It was a small expression, almost easy to miss, but Caleb noticed it. This was not just a visitor arriving. This was someone being welcomed. Caleb walked closer and introduced himself properly. The retired Marine nodded and shared his name, but he spoke only a few words. His voice was calm, and his manner was respectful, yet there was a distance that Caleb could feel. The man was not unfriendly. He simply seemed comfortable with silence. Atlas has been coming here for a while, Caleb said. The retired Marine looked down at the German shepherd beside him. He knows when to come, he replied softly. Those words stayed with Caleb. How could a dog understand something like that? Over the next few days, Caleb paid closer attention. He noticed the small details that others might overlook. The retired Marine always placed the same chair in the same spot. He always had a quiet afternoon routine. He would sit outside, look across the street, and spend time with Atlas without needing to say much. The German shepherd never demanded attention. He never interrupted the peaceful moments. He simply stayed. Caleb learned more about the retired Marine from the neighbors. They told him the man had served his country for many years and had always been someone who helped others. But after returning to civilian life, he slowly became more private. He was polite, but he stopped letting people get close. The neighbors respected his choice, though some wondered if he had become too comfortable being alone. Caleb thought about that. Sometimes people did not need someone to fix their problems. Sometimes they just needed someone who was willing to sit beside them without asking for anything in return. One afternoon, Caleb brought Atlas home later than usual. Before leaving the retired Marine's porch, he noticed something sitting near the chair. It was an old photograph inside a simple frame. The picture showed a younger version of the man standing beside another dog. Caleb did not ask about it. He understood that some memories needed to be offered, not requested. But Atlas looked at the photograph for a moment before resting beside the chair. The retired Marine placed a hand gently on the German Shepherd's back and looked toward the picture. For the first time, Caleb saw a different side of him. Not the quiet neighbor, not the retired Marine, just a person remembering someone important. As Caleb walked home with Atlas, he felt that there was a story hidden behind that photograph. A story that explained why this man, who never asked anyone else to stay, always made room for one loyal companion. And Caleb knew that Atlas had found a connection that went far beyond a simple afternoon visit. The following afternoon, Caleb Rowe arrived at the retired Marine's house a little earlier than usual. He wanted to understand the quiet connection he had been watching for days. From a distance, the relationship between Atlas and the older man seemed simple. A dog visited. A person welcomed him. But Caleb had started to realize that some of the most meaningful bonds were built in moments that looked ordinary. Atlas appeared at the end of the street just as the afternoon light began to soften. The German Shepherd walked toward the porch with the same calm confidence he always carried. The retired Marine looked up from his chair and smiled. This time, Caleb noticed something different. The man did not simply wait for Atlas to arrive. He prepared for him. A small bowl of water sat beside the chair. A blanket was folded neatly nearby. It was clear that Atlas was no longer just a visitor. He was part of the routine. Caleb sat with them for a while, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. The wind moved through the trees. A few birds rested on the fence nearby. The retired Marine remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable. After some time, Caleb asked about the photograph he had seen the day before. The old Marine looked toward the framed picture and held it carefully. "That was my partner," he said softly. Caleb understood that he was not talking about a person. The photograph showed a canine companion from many years ago, a loyal dog who had been beside him during an important chapter of his life. The retired Marine explained that the dog had been more than a working partner. He had been a source of comfort and trust, someone who stayed close without needing explanations, someone who understood quiet moments. Caleb looked at Atlas and suddenly understood why their connection felt so familiar. The German Shepherd reminded the retired Marine of a bond he had once known, not because Atlas was replacing the past, but because he was bringing back a feeling that had been missing, a feeling of companionship, a feeling of being remembered. "I never expected another dog to sit in that chair beside me," the retired Marine said. "But somehow he found his way here." Caleb listened carefully. The words carried years of emotion, even though they were spoken calmly. The man who never asked anyone else to stay had found someone who stayed without being asked. Over the next few days, Caleb noticed small changes. The retired Marine started waving to neighbors more often. He spent a few extra minutes outside after Atlas left. The porch that once felt distant began to feel welcoming. Atlas did not change the man with grand gestures. He simply showed up every afternoon. He offered friendship without expecting anything in return. One evening, as Caleb watched Atlas rest beside the old Marine's chair, he realized something important. Some hearts do not open because someone knocks harder. They open because someone patiently waits outside the door. And Atlas had been waiting all along. The days continued, and Caleb Rowe began to notice something changing around the quiet house at the end of the street. It was not a dramatic change. There were no big announcements or sudden moments that everyone could see. It happened slowly, like the first light of morning appearing through the clouds. The retired Marine was still a man who valued silence, but the silence no longer felt like a wall. Atlas had created a small opening. Every afternoon, the German Shepherd arrived with the same gentle purpose, and every afternoon, the old Marine made room beside him. Caleb often wondered what had happened in the years before Atlas came into his life. What memories had caused this man to close himself away from the world? One afternoon, while sitting on the porch, Caleb noticed a small wooden box near the old photograph. It looked like something that had been kept safely for many years. The retired Marine saw Caleb looking at it and remained quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the box and placed it on the table. Inside were a few simple items: An old canine collar, a faded picture, a small note written by hand. Each object carried a piece of a story that had never been shared with many people. The retired Marine explained that years earlier, he had worked alongside a canine partner who taught him the meaning of trust. They spent countless days together, moving through life with a bond that did not require many words. That companion was there during difficult moments and quiet moments. The dog had a way of knowing when to stay close. Caleb listened carefully as the man spoke. It was the most he had heard him share since they met. The retired Marine looked at the old collar in his hands, and Caleb saw a mixture of gratitude and sadness in his eyes. After losing that connection, I thought I would never feel it again, the man said quietly. Atlas rested near his feet, listening to every word. Caleb realized something important. Atlas was not there to replace a memory. He was there to remind someone that a bond built on trust could still exist. The next afternoon, something unexpected happened. A neighbor walked by and stopped to say hello. Usually, the retired Marine would give a polite greeting and return to his quiet routine. But this time, he continued the conversation for a few minutes. Caleb noticed the difference immediately. The door that had been closed for years was opening little by little. Not because anyone forced it open. Not because someone demanded change. It opened because someone had been patient enough to wait. Atlas continued his visits, and the retired Marine continued making space beside him. Their routine became something the neighborhood quietly looked forward to. Children walking home from school would wave. Neighbors would stop and share a few words. The porch that once felt distant slowly became part of the community again. Caleb watched Atlas resting beside the chair one afternoon and smiled. The German Shepherd had never needed to speak. He had never needed to explain why he returned every day. His loyalty was the message. His presence was the answer. And Caleb was beginning to understand that sometimes healing does not arrive with a loud announcement. Sometimes it arrives quietly, walks up the steps, and simply chooses to stay. The afternoon sun rested softly over the neighborhood as Caleb Rowe walked with Atlas toward the retired Marine's house. By now, the routine had become familiar to everyone who lived nearby. The German Shepherd would arrive at the same time each day, walk up the same steps, and sit beside the same old chair. But Caleb had started to notice that something else was changing. It was not just the retired Marine. It was the entire space around him. The porch that once felt quiet and distant was slowly becoming a place where people felt welcome. One afternoon, Caleb arrived and saw something he had never seen before. The retired Marine was talking with a neighbor. It was only a short conversation, but it was meaningful. The old man was asking about the neighborhood, listening to a story, and even smiling. Atlas rested beside the chair as if he had been waiting for this moment. Caleb realized that the German Shepherd had never been trying to change the retired Marine. He had simply been reminding him that connection was still possible. Later that day, Caleb asked about the old canine collar inside the wooden box. The retired Marine looked at it carefully before answering. He explained that his former canine partner had taught him lessons that stayed with him long after their time together ended. The dog had shown him patience, trust, and the comfort of having someone nearby without needing explanations. Caleb looked at Atlas and understood the connection more clearly. Atlas carried the same quiet energy. He did not ask questions. He did not expect anything. He simply showed up. The retired Marine shared that after his canine partner was gone, he stopped looking for another connection like that. He believed some bonds only happened once in a lifetime. But then Atlas appeared, not as a replacement, not as a reminder of what was lost. Instead, Atlas brought a new chapter into his life, a chapter he never expected to begin. Over the following weeks, Caleb watched small changes continue. The retired Marine started walking around the neighborhood more often. He greeted people he once only nodded to. He even spent time repairing a few old items around his porch. The house slowly began to feel different. The windows opened more often. The chair was no longer a place of waiting. It became a place of sharing. One evening, Caleb sat with the retired Marine and Atlas as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The old man looked at the German Shepherd beside him and smiled. "He reminds me that some things are worth waiting for," he said. Caleb looked across the quiet street and thought about everything that had happened. A dog had walked into the life of someone who had stopped expecting visitors. A simple afternoon routine had become a bridge between the past and the present. Atlas had not arrived with answers. He had arrived with presence. And sometimes, that was the one thing a person needed most. The next afternoon, something happened that showed Caleb just how much had changed. For the first time since he had known him, the retired Marine did not wait for Atlas to arrive. He stepped outside first and looked down the street, as if he was the one hoping someone would come. And when Atlas appeared in the distance, the old man smiled before the German shepherd even reached the porch. The next afternoon arrived with the same peaceful rhythm that had slowly become familiar to everyone in the neighborhood. The warm sunlight stretched across the sidewalks, and the quiet sound of Atlas walking beside Caleb Rowe filled the afternoon air. But this day felt different. Caleb could sense that something had shifted. The retired Marine was no longer simply waiting on his porch for a visitor. He was beginning to become part of the world around him again. When Atlas reached the house, the old man was already outside. His chair was placed beneath the shade, and beside it sat a small table with 2 cups of water. Caleb smiled when he saw it. The simple gesture showed how much had changed. A person who once avoided connection was now preparing a place for it. Atlas walked up the steps and rested beside the chair like he had done countless times before. The retired Marine gently looked at him and smiled. "You always know when to come," he said softly. Caleb sat nearby and watched the two of them. There was something peaceful about their relationship. It was not built on words or expectations. It was built on trust. Later that afternoon, the retired Marine invited Caleb inside his home for the first time. It was a small moment, but Caleb understood its meaning. This was a door that had remained closed for years. Inside, the house was simple and carefully kept. The walls held memories from another time. There were photographs from his years of service, old keepsakes, and reminders of a life filled with responsibility and dedication. In one corner of the room was a small shelf with a framed picture of his former canine partner. Caleb noticed that the retired Marine looked at the photograph with the same quiet respect he showed Atlas. The man explained that after his canine companion was gone, the house became much quieter. He continued living his life, but something important was missing. Not a possession, not a place, a connection. "People think silence is peaceful," the retired Marine said. "Sometimes it is. But sometimes silence just means there is no one beside you." Caleb remembered those words. They carried the weight of years spent alone. Atlas moved across the room and rested near the old photograph. The retired Marine watched him for a moment and smiled. It was as if the German shepherd understood that the memory mattered. That evening, Caleb walked home with Atlas beside him. He thought about how easily people could overlook someone's loneliness. The retired Marine had not needed someone to solve his life. He had only needed someone willing to share a quiet moment. The next few days brought more small changes. The retired Marine started joining neighbors for short conversations. He accepted simple invitations. He even laughed more often. Nothing about him had completely changed. He was still calm. He still enjoyed quiet moments. But now, those quiet moments were no longer empty. Caleb looked at Atlas and realized the German shepherd had done something remarkable without ever trying. He had reminded one person that being cared for was still possible. And sometimes, the greatest gift is not changing someone's life overnight. Sometimes it is simply showing up every afternoon until they remember they were never meant to be alone. The neighborhood slowly began to notice the difference. It was not something that happened all at once. There was no single moment when everything changed. Instead, it happened through small afternoons, quiet conversations, and simple gestures that showed a heart beginning to open again. Caleb Rowe saw it every day when he walked with Atlas toward the retired Marine's house. The porch that once felt distant had become a place where people stopped for a few minutes. The old chair beneath the tree was no longer just a place for one person to sit alone. It had become a place where stories were shared. One afternoon, Caleb arrived and saw something that surprised him. A few neighbors were standing near the porch, talking with the retired Marine. The man who once avoided long conversations was now listening carefully and responding with a calm smile. Atlas sat beside him, watching quietly as if he knew this moment mattered. Caleb stood back and watched. He understood that the German shepherd had never forced anything to happen. Atlas had simply created a reason for people to come closer. The following week, the neighborhood organized a small gathering nearby. It was nothing large. Just a few families, some food, and conversations beneath the afternoon sky. Caleb noticed the retired Marine standing at the edge of the group at first, unsure if he belonged. But then Atlas walked beside him and rested near his feet. Slowly, the man stepped forward. Someone asked him about his years with canine companions, and for the first time, he shared stories with people who truly wanted to listen. His voice remained calm, but his expression changed as he remembered those moments. He spoke about the lessons he learned from his canine partner. Trust, patience, loyalty, the kind of connection that does not disappear when time passes. Caleb watched the people around him. Everyone was quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood the importance of the moment. The retired Marine was not simply sharing old memories. He was allowing others to see a part of himself he had protected for years. Later that afternoon, Caleb sat beside him while Atlas rested in the shade. "I think he knew before we did," Caleb said softly. The retired Marine looked down at Atlas and smiled. "Dogs notice what people miss," he replied. Those words stayed with Caleb. Atlas had noticed the loneliness hidden behind a quiet face. He had noticed the person behind the uniform. He had noticed someone who did not need advice or sympathy, only a companion who would return every day. As the weeks passed, the retired Marine became more connected with the neighborhood. He helped repair old garden areas, greeted people walking by, and spent more time outside. The changes were small, but they were real. Caleb understood that healing was not about forgetting the past. It was about finding a way to carry the past while still making room for new moments. One evening, Caleb watched Atlas walk up the familiar path one more time. The German Shepherd did not hurry because he knew exactly where he was going. He was returning to the person who once believed he had no one left to stay. And now, that person was no longer waiting in silence. He was waiting with hope. The afternoon light settled gently over the neighborhood, painting the quiet streets with a warm golden glow. Caleb Rowe walked beside Atlas as they followed the familiar path toward the retired Marine's house. But this time, something felt different. The house that once seemed hidden from the world had become a place where people gathered, where stories were shared, and where silence no longer meant being alone. The retired Marine sat beneath the tree beside his old chair, watching the street with a peaceful expression. Atlas walked up the steps and rested beside him, just as he had done countless times before. But now, the moment was no longer only between them. It had become a reminder for everyone who witnessed it. Caleb noticed how the retired Marine carried himself differently. He still enjoyed quiet afternoons. He still appreciated simple moments. But there was a new warmth in the way he greeted people. He no longer looked like someone waiting for the day to end. He looked like someone enjoying the day he had been given. One afternoon, Caleb brought a few old photographs that the retired Marine had shared during their conversations. Together, they looked through the memories of his former canine partner. Each picture carried a story, a different place, a different moment, a different reminder of the loyalty they shared. Atlas stayed close, his calm eyes moving between Caleb and the retired Marine. The German Shepherd seemed to understand that these memories mattered. The retired Marine smiled as he looked at the photographs. "I thought those days were behind me," he said quietly. Caleb looked at Atlas and then back at him. "Maybe they were not behind you," Caleb replied. "Maybe they were leading you here." The retired Marine did not answer right away. He simply looked toward Atlas and placed a hand gently on the dog's shoulder. There was gratitude in that small moment. Not sadness, not regret, just appreciation for a new friendship that arrived when he least expected it. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood continued to change. The retired Marine began spending more time outside. He shared stories with families who passed by. He helped younger neighbors learn about patience and responsibility. The same person who once kept his world small was now quietly becoming someone others looked up to. Caleb realized that Atlas had created something much bigger than a daily visit. The German Shepherd had become a bridge between a person and a community. He had reminded people that some individuals do not need to be pushed into opening their hearts. They simply need someone who believes they are worth waiting for. One evening, Caleb sat beside the retired Marine as the sun lowered behind the houses. Atlas rested between them, completely peaceful. The street was quiet, but it was no longer an empty kind of quiet. It was the peaceful sound of people who knew they belonged somewhere. "You know," the retired Marine said, looking at Atlas, "I used to think staying was something people chose for a reason." He paused and smiled. "But sometimes, someone stays because they already know you matter." Caleb looked at the German Shepherd beside him. Atlas had never asked for anything. He had never expected a reward. He simply returned every afternoon. And in doing so, He helped someone remember that connection could still find its way back. As the evening breeze moved through the trees, Caleb understood the truth behind Atlas's visits. The German Shepherd was not only keeping an old promise alive, he was helping create a new one. The afternoon sun continued to visit the quiet neighborhood, just like Atlas did every day. The familiar path, the old wooden chair, and the peaceful porch had become symbols of something much greater than a simple routine. Caleb Rowe often thought about the first time he saw the German Shepherd walking toward that house. Back then, it seemed like a small mystery. A dog visiting the same person every afternoon. A retired Marine who rarely spoke and never asked anyone to stay. But now Caleb understood. Atlas had not been following a habit. He had been following a purpose. Months had passed since the first visit, and the change was visible in ways that only a few people noticed. The retired Marine still enjoyed quiet moments. He still valued his peaceful afternoons beneath the tree. But the loneliness that once surrounded him had slowly faded. The porch was no longer a place of waiting. It had become a place of connection. Neighbors stopped by. Stories were shared. Smiles appeared where silence once remained. And every afternoon, Atlas was there. One evening, Caleb sat beside the retired Marine as the sky turned golden above the street. Atlas rested between them, calm and comfortable. The old Marine looked toward the house and took a slow breath. For a long time, I thought I had already experienced the best connections life could offer, he said. I thought some chapters were simply finished. Caleb looked at him quietly. The man continued. Then this dog showed up and reminded me that new chapters can begin at any age. Those words stayed with Caleb, because that was what Atlas had truly given him. Not a replacement for the past, not a way to forget old memories. A new reason to look forward to tomorrow. The next afternoon, something beautiful happened. A young neighbor brought a small gift for Atlas. Another person stopped by just to say hello. The retired Marine laughed as he watched the German Shepherd receive attention from everyone around him. Caleb smiled because he remembered the day when nobody knew why Atlas kept coming. Now they understood. The dog had seen someone who needed companionship. Someone who had spent years being strong for others, but had forgotten what it felt like to simply be cared for. Atlas never needed words to show loyalty. He never needed recognition. He only needed to return. Every afternoon. Every single time. As the sun began to set, Caleb watched Atlas walk back toward the porch one final time that day. The retired Marine opened the door before the dog reached the steps. That small action said everything. The man who once kept the world outside had learned that some visitors are not interruptions. Some visitors are blessings. Caleb stood quietly and watched the two of them sit together beneath the fading light. There was no dramatic moment, no grand celebration, just peace, just trust, just the quiet comfort of knowing someone would return tomorrow. And that was the greatest gift Atlas had given. He reminded one retired Marine that being needed never truly ends. It only changes shape. Sometimes it arrives through a friend, sometimes through a neighbor, and sometimes it walks on four paws, arrives every afternoon, and simply chooses to stay.